Hello and welcome to the show, everybody. I'm your host, Jack Canfield, and today joining me is an amazingly cool guy that I actually deeply respect and I think you're going to come to love. His name is Gary Rosenthal. Gary's a modern day bard. If you don't know what that means, it's like a poet, wise person all put into one. And it's a poet, he would describe it, who brings both healing and a cultural critique together. And while serving as a custodian of our culture's storehouse of myths. Now, Gary's also a psychotherapist, which provides all these things in his new nonfiction book, Revisioning Narcissism, Healing Heresies for Polarized Times, which we're going to talk about today, which I really love. And I just want to say this about his poetry. He's written a book, which I encourage you to get also, even though it won't be the main thing we talk about, called The You That Is Everywhere. And I don't usually like poetry that much, but I read this book in one sitting, cover to cover. I kept dog-earing pages. I'm going to read this one to my wife. I'm going to tell that one to my secretary. I'm going to send that one to my son. So it's really a great book, and we'll talk about that briefly as well. Anyway, welcome to the show, Gary.
Good to be here, Jack.
Thank you very much. So let's start with your narcissism book really quickly. How and why did you come to write Revisioning Narcissism?
Yeah. To answer that question, I think I'll start by saying that the English word myth comes from mythos, which is the Greek word for story. And so as we begin our conversation, I hear you asking me for a specific kind of story, an origin story, a creation myth of sorts for how and why my book came to be. So without even trying, we're sort of already in a mythic field. And the book that we're going to be primarily talking about, the myth of Narcissus and Echo, is also the central myth standing behind narcissism. And as my life led me to enter the mythic field of that book, it led to what could be characterized as one discovery after another. Yet the impetus for writing the book actually began earlier in another mythic field, where a goddess is innocently picking flowers without being aware of what would follow from what she just picked. For as she lifted an alluring narcissus flower from the field, lifted its root ball from the field, the Lord of the underworld, Pluto, grabs her, drags her down into the underworld. And I'd characterize the way I experienced that story, both as initiatory and as a series of heartbreaking events. And since the heartbreak happened first, I'll start with that story before the other. So the seminal narrative of heartbreaking events could begin with the sentence, "There was a woman." And Jack, haven't so many stories, begun with that line? Now, the lady in question, to my eyes at least, was the most beautiful woman in the world. And she was also amazingly empathic. And as we were first discovering each other, her empathic nature combined with her beauty impacted my heart in a way that, like 25 or 30 years of Buddhist meditation never had. And, so she was the woman that is sort of the centerpiece of the book that you mentioned, the You That Is Everywhere. That collection of poems arose from my knowing of her. And she was also, by her own admission, deeply identified with the goddess Persephone. And as you should surmise by now, I was deeply in love with her, yet yearly she'd break up with me, though the strange part of this heartbreaking loss was that this always happened as the seasons moved from autumn into winter. And then in the spring, when she returned from her underworld sojourns, my heart went back into bloom, much as the green world sprung into bloom with Persephone's return from the underworld at the end of each winter, because this myth accounts mythically for how we got to get to winter, because, like Persephone's mother, Demeter, when she disappeared. And Demeter was the goddess of vegetation and grain crops. And so when she disappeared, Demeter got so depressed she could no longer do her job, which was making sure that the crops would grow. So the humans began to starve. And finally, Zeus sends Hermes down into the underworld and brings her back. And the second, because the humans had been starving with nothing to eat. And the second her feet touch the earth, comes up from the underworld and touch the earth, at that moment, spring begins, the crops start to bloom again, and everything is cool. But because she had eaten 3 seeds of a pomegranate while she was in the underworld, she had to return every year. So this cyclic nature that I was noting in my girlfriend was just totally being lived out, by the woman that I was in love with.
So let me guide you back. You wrote a book about narcissism in our culture. Mm-hmm. And you've talked about, some of our leaders are narcissists, as we obviously know. It's becoming more rampant around the world. You talked about the fact that there are 4 things that have to be looked at if narcissism is going to be fully understood. More than just psychology, it requires spirituality and the mythic part you're talking about now. And so there was a moment in time where you said, okay, I'm going to sit down in front of the typewriter here and I'm going to write this, which I think is a very profound book. What was that moment that said, okay, this message has to get out to the culture because the culture is hurting because of this untreated narcissism?
The weird thing is, like when it comes to the myth I just told you about, I can identify how and when it started. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't so much that I had a conclusive moment that I chose to write about narcissism. What actually happened was that one winter, when both my girlfriend and my book disappeared, it also had been abducted into the underworld, which is a long story, but it involved the loss of my distributor and rumors of...
This is your poetry book you're talking about.
And it's had amazing success. Like it sold out a large print run in the first 90 days, thousands more rush ordered from the printer. And then I discovered that the distributor had been sued into bankruptcy. And all of a sudden, the books disappeared from brick and mortar shelves. And at this time, I felt that my literary career, such nascent though it was in danger of going through the tubes, because I didn't know if I'd ever write a book of poetry that good again. And at this point, I'd encountered some advice that Robert Graves, who was a British poet born in the late 19th century, and also, like me, deeply involved in mythology. He said that a poet should write the occasional nonfiction book because in that way he created a crossover audience, plus publishers would be more willing to publish his less commercial poetry. So this became real impetus. I have to write a nonfiction book, and no one told me how long it would take to get any good at it. And no one, unfortunately, told me anything about marketing books. I thought that all you had to do was write one and you'd be cool. Right. So it actually started with that. But then what began to happen was from the experience I'd had with the Persephone myth, because in the winters when she would disappear, I began to first read and write mythology. So that's when I first began to write about mythology. So the Persephone myth actually led into my writing about the Narcissus myth. But I can't tell you the moment I said, light bulb, write about narcissism. I just started doing it.
Well, talk a little bit about narcissism. Like, what is it from your perspective? And I know you've thought, you write about the fact that basically a lot of people said it's not treatable. It's something that's not going to go away. I know you don't agree with that. And what's the breakthrough you think that you've made that allows us to understand it more fully and now perhaps treat it so that we don't have to?
Well, just as I began to read everything I could about the Pluto and Persephone myth, I began to read everything I could about narcissism because I was starting to see it appearing in my consulting room, and to a much greater degree than the book that I was consulting to understand it better, which was the Diagnostic and Statistical Manuals of Mental Disorders. And it turned out to be very, it was just totally not enough. It was not a very deep vision. And it was telling us that the incidence of, in the last 2 editions, it was telling us that the prevalence of narcissism in the American population could be as low as 0% at the low end of its estimate, and no more than 6.2% at the high end. This simply did not jive with what was walking into my consulting room or what was walking into the consulting rooms of friends of mine who were therapists. And it also didn't jive with the longest running study that had ever been done on narcissism in America by a group of social psychologists over a course of more than 20 years with American college students. And what they concluded was that narcissism has actually been increasing by 30% during the course of their study. And by the study's end, 2/3 of the students were scoring highly on a narcissism index. So this was the first intimation to me that narcissism has been badly in need of revisioning.
Given that what you now understand is the need for understanding it from these 4 different perspectives, how are you treating it, or how should people treat it that's new, that wasn't being done or isn't being done from your perspective?
Okay, let me answer that question. But first, because one of the 4 avenues of vision is historical, let's go back to the early 20th century, just quick. So 2 things happened that are pertinent to what we're talking about now. One thing is in the early 20th century, the early psychoanalysts had already concluded that narcissism isn't treatable. Mm-hmm. And when you have that as your operating premise, you're less apt to discover healing pathways for whatever it is that you're looking at, number one. But also at the same time, early in the 20th century, as modern psychology was first emerging and attempting to establish itself as a legitimate scientific and medical discipline, it elected to divorce itself from its close cousins, which were the world's religious and spiritual traditions. Mm. And then, we have psychology beginning to march under Freud's banner of where it is, there shall ego be. But isn't that kind of like egocentricity the very problem of narcissism? Mm-hmm. So I think that one of the things that needs to happen is that there needs to become now a better conversation between modern psychology and the spiritual traditions. And hopefully in the process, each of them will acquire a kind of hybrid vigor that will really empower them both. But one of the things about the myth about narcissism and the myth of it, to get now on the mythic wavelength, the mythic avenue, is that, basically, Freud said something that was really quite humbling, though. I don't want to falsely characterize him as being a total, dickhead. He had said that wherever I go, I find that a poet has been before me. And one of the ways that that's true is in terms of myth. So what happened, there's no one single correct way to interpret any myth, to believe that is a kind of mythic fundamentalism. And whether it's with myth or religion or psychology, that kind of fundamentalism actually creates a narrowing of vision. So what happened was around 2,000 years ago, or even longer, the Greek poets began thinking about narcissism. They gave us the myth that stands behind it. And they were sort of like, the analogy would be like today with a pop singer or a cover band offering their renditions of a popular song. So the poets at that time did the same. But almost all of them, these early versions, they didn't have enough depth to be much use for us today. But the exception was Ovid, the Roman poet Ovid. His version was a radical departure, and I made a lot of use of the psychological and spiritual nuances of Ovid in writing my book. And it gave us a completely transformational understanding of the myth and of narcissism and of what heals it. Early in the myth, like Tiresias, who's the archetypal seer of the Greek mythopoeic world, narcissism's concerned mother goes to have a consultation with him. And he says, "Oh, your son will live to a ripe old age, providing he never comes to know himself." And then at the myth's end, he encounters this strange pool that Ovid tells us doesn't reflect ordinary things, like cattle or leaves. And he enters a kind of depth vision into this pool, and it leads to his death. This is like a youthful, so we have to assume that some kind of self-knowledge took place. And I would maintain that that kind of self-knowledge is exactly what the spiritual traditions have to offer to this conversation. It's kind of a metaphoric death. And then there's a whole section in the book where I write about different other kinds of like transformational gazes that spiritual adepts have used over the years in order to transform their own egocentric vision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Who do you think should read your book?
I think anybody who's a psychologist should read the book. Mm-hmm. I think it would be interesting to poets. I think it would be interesting to an intelligent lay audience. But, you know, it's not for everybody. You have to have a certain amount of stamina to read this book. This is not pop psychology.
No, well, that's what I liked about it. You know, I've not read the whole book yet. I've read maybe the first quarter of it. And the reason I say that is I would skim a book before I did an interview when I heard it was a good book, as yours was, but I just couldn't stop turning the pages to the next page, and given the time I had, that's what I did. And I think you bring it home. And what I love about the book too, is it creates a great deal of awareness, at least from my point of view, about what we're faced with in America, our division in our country, the two sides, the lack of awareness, the political leadership that often is narcissistic on many, many sides, not just one person.
Yeah, that's why the subtitle of the book is Healing Heresies for Polarized Times. What I'm saying, everything I'm saying is a heresy to psychological orthodoxy.
Right. But
at times like this, we need a little heresy.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think we need the spiritual insight as well. It's missing from a lot of people. And it's unfortunate that science separated itself from it. I think it's starting to come back again in a lot of things, whether it's quantum physics or people understanding how energy works. And,
yes.
and shamanism is becoming more aware, and Eastern religions and so forth. So that it's becoming more integrated, if you will, into our world. Any final thoughts before I ask you where people can find out more about your work?
I probably have about 3,048 of them just below the surface of my mind.
One.
I don't know. Read the book.
Read the book. Okay, that's good. And I really do think I'm going to recommend to people that it's a book not unlike My Success Principles. It's a thick book. You look at it and you think, man, this might be a little overwhelming. But I think it's amazingly elucidating and amazingly, I don't want to say entertaining, but I just felt wiser and uplifted knowing what the book shares. And so I want to congratulate you on writing in a way that really produces that effect. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Jack. If I had 4 more readers like you, I'd be a rich man. Which internally maybe not. I wouldn't sell necessarily 600 million books like a certain person I'm talking to, but
I understand.
I'd sell at least 10.
So tell people where they can find your book and how they can find out more about you and your work.
Yeah, you can get in touch with me and buy my books through any of my 3 websites. One of them is you could go to the Narcissism Books website, which is revisitingnarcissism.com. And there you can also send me an email or order books. And then I think my other websites are sacredpsychology.net and GaryRosenthal.net. But I'm making a new website now. And if you go to the Revisioning Narcissism website, you can also, what do you call it? When you write your email address down, you can subscribe. And then I'll let you know not only where to go find the new website, but I'll also let you know whenever new blog articles, poems, or videos get posted, so you'll know that. And then I'll have your email address, which is supposed to be very helpful in marketing books, they say.
Good. And also relaunching your poetry book, which deserves a much broader readership.
Thank you. I have to say one other thing I feel a bit embarrassed about. I've got 5 other books that I've recently completed. So if anybody knows an agent or a publisher who might be interested in me, please get in touch with me. I'd be especially interested. And also anybody who might want to invite me to give keynotes or poetry readings or lead the occasional spiritual retreat or any kind of teaching. I want to get back into that once I get these books a little bit better launched.
All right, good. Well, I encourage people to do that.
Okay.
Well, again, we probably needed 3 hours to really dive deep, but we didn't have that. But thanks for joining me today, Gary. I really
Thank you so much, Jack, for your generosity and for all that you do for other writers.
My pleasure. So, as I said, I think this book's an extremely important one. I encourage all of you viewers to take a shot at it and go to his website, get a copy of the book, and read it. And thanks to all of you for tuning in today. Make sure to tune in next week, where I'll have another important thought leader who can help you understand things at a deeper level and apply more wisdom to creating a happier and healthier life for yourself, your family, and your community at large. Until then, stay well.